The Zephyrian Chronicles speak of a silence that fell across the galaxy. Not the peaceful quiet of sleep, but the terrifying hush that comes when even the stars hold their breath. It was the kind of silence that made entire civilizations pause their wars, their trade, their very existence, to listen to something that shouldn't have been possible. They called it the human landing. For 3,000 years, the galaxy had known war. The Caliph Dominion, with their crystalline ships that could shatter planets, had crushed every resistance. Billions of species had fallen. Hope had become a word spoken only in whispers, if at all. The galaxy had accepted its fate, eternal servitude to the crystal tyrants who fed on suffering itself. But then the humans arrived, not with fanfare or grand announcements, not with the usual alien first contact protocols. They simply landed on worlds where the last defenders were drawing their final breaths, on planets where children had forgotten how to dream of tomorrow, on battlefields where heroes lay dying among the ashes of their civilizations. And when they did, something impossible happened. The galaxy went quiet. Even the Caliph stopped their advance, their crystalline minds struggling to comprehend what their sensors were telling them. These weren't just another species joining the war. These weren't refugees or conquerors or traitors. These were something else entirely. The humans had brought something with them that the galaxy had lost so long ago, most had forgotten it ever existed. They brought something more powerful than the Caliph's crystal technology, more devastating than their planet killers, more terrifying than their mind-breaking torture chambers. They brought hope. And hope, as the galaxy was about to learn, was the most dangerous weapon in the universe. Commander Thrix, 9 of the Zirian Defense Corps, pressed his back against the crumbling wall, feeling the vibrations of approaching Caliph war machines through the stone. His blue-scaled hand gripped his plasma rifle with desperate strength, though he knew it would be useless against what was coming. The crystalline predators didn't just kill. They harvested suffering, feeding on the despair of dying worlds before moving on to their next meal. Around him, the last 37 defenders of Zirian Prime huddled in the ruins of what had once been their capital's greatest library. The irony wasn't lost on Thrix. They would die surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of their civilization, knowledge that would crumble to dust along with their bodies when the Caliph crystal ships finished their work. The youngest defender, barely more than a hatchling named Kess, too, clutched a broken communicator to her chest. She'd been trying to reach other worlds for 3 days now, sending out desperate calls for help that echoed into the void. No one answered anymore. The galaxy had learned that responding to distress calls only brought the Caliph to your doorstep faster. "Commander," whispered Vex 7, the squad's demolitions expert, "the crystal crawlers are moving through Sector 12. We have maybe 10 minutes before they breach the North Wall." Thrix nodded grimly. He'd seen what the Caliph crystal crawlers did to living beings. The creatures didn't just kill. They slowly converted organic matter into more crystal, keeping their victims conscious throughout the agonizing transformation. The lucky ones died from shock. The unlucky ones lived long enough to feel themselves become weapons for their own people's destruction. "Send a final transmission," Thrix ordered, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his hearts. "Let the galaxy know that Zirian Prime fell fighting." Kess 2's claws worked frantically over the communicator's damaged controls. Static filled the air, punctuated by the distant sound of crystal spears punching through metal and stone. The Caliph were methodical in their destruction, taking their time to savor every moment of fear they could extract from the dying world. "I'm getting something," Kess 2 suddenly gasped, her reptilian features brightening with desperate hope. "There's a response signal. It's not from any known species signature. Probably Caliph psychological warfare." Vex 7 spat. "They like to pretend to be rescuers right before they strike." But Thrix heard something in the static that made his scales ripple with an emotion he'd thought lost forever. The signal had a rhythm to it, almost like music. Not the harsh, crystalline tones the Caliph used, but something warmer, something alive. "Unknown vessel. This is Commander Thrix, 9 of the Zirian Defense Corps." He spoke into the communicator, knowing he was probably signing their death warrant faster. "Zirian Prime has fallen. We are the last defenders. If you're real, stay away. There's nothing here but death now." The response came immediately, in a voice speaking accented, but understandable galactic common. "Commander Thrix, this is Captain Sarah Chun of the Terran Expeditionary Force. We're reading your position. Hold tight, we're coming to get you." Thrix felt his blood chill. He'd never heard of Terrans. In his 100 years of military service, he'd encountered representatives from thousands of species across the galaxy. The name meant nothing to him, which in the current situation meant only one thing. These newcomers had no idea what they were flying into. Unknown Terrans, he said urgently. You don't understand. The Caliph Dominion has over 40 crystal ships in this system. They've been harvesting this world for 3 days. Whatever weapons you have, they won't be enough. Save yourselves and warn others. Don't let our deaths be meaningless. A pause, then a sound Thrix had never heard over a military communication channel. Laughter. Not the mad cackle of someone broken by despair, but genuine, warm amusement. Commander, came Captain Chen's voice. With respect, you don't understand. We didn't come here to run from the Caliph. We came here to introduce ourselves. Properly. Before Thrix could ask what that meant, the ground shook with an impact that dwarfed anything the Caliph had produced. Through the gaps in the ruined ceiling, brilliant light blazed across the sky. Not the cold, blue-white light of Caliph crystal weapons, but warm, golden fire that seemed to push back the perpetual twilight the invaders had brought to Zirian Prime. What was that? Kess, too, whispered, pressing herself against the window. Thrix joined her, peering up at the sky through the rubble. What he saw defied everything he thought he knew about space warfare. A massive ship, easily twice the size of the largest Caliph crystal dreadnought, hung in the atmosphere above them. But it wasn't built like any vessel he'd ever encountered. Where Caliph ships were all sharp angles and cruel spikes designed to intimidate, this ship had curved lines and rounded edges. Where alien ships typically had matte, absorptive hulls to avoid detection, this one gleamed like polished metal, almost daring enemies to fire at it. Terran vessel. Thrix spoke into his communicator with growing amazement. We can see your ship, but the Caliph have surrounded this area with crystal crawlers. You can't land without being swarmed. Already handled, Commander, came the cheerful reply. Our Marines are handling the local pest problem. Should be clear for landing in about 30 seconds. As if summoned by her words, new sounds echoed through the ruins. Not the clicking, skittering noise of crystal crawlers, but something else entirely. Sharp cracks like thunder, followed by what sounded like explosions. But underneath it all, Thrix heard voices, actual voices, shouting to each other in coordinated tactics. Contact left. Jenkins suppressing fire on that crystal spitter. Roger that. Someone get me a clear shot at those legs. Grenade out. Everyone down. Tango down. Move to the next cluster. Vex. Seven stared at the others in bewilderment. Are they actually fighting the crystal crawlers? In the open? On foot? The answer came in the form of a human soldier dropping through the hole in their ceiling. Thrix raised his weapon instinctively, then lowered it in shock. The being that landed in a perfect combat crouch was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Bipedal like several species he knew, but there was something in the way it moved that spoke of dangerous competence. It wore armor that seemed to blend advanced technology with practical design, and in its hands was a weapon that hummed with barely contained energy. The human, Thrix somehow knew this was one of the Terrans, lifted its helmet visor, revealing a face that was startlingly expressive. Brown skin, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and when it saw the huddled defenders, it actually smiled. Commander Thrix? The human asked, and, despite the situation, its voice carried genuine warmth. I am Sergeant Martinez, Terran Marines. We're here to escort you to safety. Sergeant, Thrix said carefully, there are over 200 crystal crawlers between here and your ship, plus 3 Caliph hunter-killers that have been systematically clearing buildings. You can't possibly. His words were cut off by a tremendous explosion that shook dust from the ceiling. Through the communicator, Captain Chen's voice crackled with professional satisfaction. Commander, the hunter-killers have been neutralized. My Marines report the area is secure for extraction. Sergeant Martinez grinned, and Thrix saw something in that expression that made his scales stand on end. It wasn't cruelty or madness. It was confidence. Complete, unshakable confidence in the face of impossible odds. With respect, Commander, Martinez said, extending a hand to help Thrix to his feet. You haven't seen humans fight yet. As if to emphasize the point, more explosions echoed outside, followed by what sounded like cheering. Not the desperate battle cries of doomed defenders, but the celebratory shouts of soldiers enjoying their work. Kess, Two peered through the window again, then gasped. "Commander, you need to see this." Thrix looked outside and felt his worldview shift fundamentally. The plaza that had been crawling with crystal crawlers just minutes before was now clear. Smoking craters marked where the creatures had been, and human soldiers were methodically checking the area with the efficiency of professionals who had done this many times before. As he watched, one of them kicked a piece of crystal debris and made a comment that caused several others to laugh. They were laughing. In the middle of a war zone, facing an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for 3 millennia, these humans were laughing. "Ow, Vex," Seven whispered. "How is this possible?" Sergeant Martinez checked something on his wrist device. Orders are to extract all survivors to the ship for medical evaluation and debriefing. Captain Shin wants to hear everything you know about Caliph capabilities. Apparently, we're planning something the Admiral calls a proper introduction to the neighborhood. You don't understand, Thrix said desperately. The Caliph feed on suffering. They don't just conquer worlds, they torture them. They've broken species that have fought wars for millions of years. They're not just powerful, he struggled for the word. Evil. Martinez supplied helpfully. Yeah, we got the briefing. Captain's got some thoughts about that. Through the communicator, Captain Shin's voice carried a tone that made Thrix's blood run cold. Not with fear, but with something he'd forgotten existed. Hope mixed with righteous anger. Commander Thrix, in about 6 hours, the main Caliph fleet is going to arrive to see why their advance force went quiet. When they do, they're going to learn something important about humans. What's that? Thrix found himself asking. The captain's voice carried a smile that promised terrible things for the Caliph. They're going to learn that humans really don't like bullies. As Sergeant Martinez led them toward the exit, Thrix felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 3 years of hopeless fighting, he wasn't just trying to die well. He was beginning to believe they might actually win. The galaxy was about to change forever, and it started with 37 survivors in the ruins of a library, being rescued by soldiers who laughed in the face of humanity's nightmare. Outside, the human Marines had formed a perimeter, their weapons tracking the sky where Caliph reinforcements might appear. But they weren't defensive positions. They were hunting positions. These humans weren't planning to run from the monsters that had terrorized the galaxy. They were planning to fight. And from the sounds echoing across the city, explosions, weapons fire, and increasingly frequent human laughter, Thrix was beginning to think the monsters should be afraid. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood before the massive holographic display in the war room of the U.S. Determination, studying the tactical readouts with the same intensity she'd once used to analyze chess problems. Around her, representatives from a dozen species sat or stood according to their physiology, all of them struggling to process what they'd witnessed in the past 18 hours. Commander Thrix, 9, still couldn't quite believe he was alive, much less participating in what the humans called a war council. The massive human ship was unlike anything in his experience, not just in its size and obvious power, but in its entire philosophy of design. Where most military vessels were cramped, utilitarian spaces designed for maximum efficiency, the Determination felt almost like a city. Corridors were wide enough for comfortable movement, common areas had what could only be described as art, and the mess hall had actually been playing music when he passed through it. Music? On a warship? During combat operations? Let me make sure I understand the tactical situation, Admiral Vasquez said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that Thrix associated with the best military minds he'd known. The Caliph Dominion has been systematically conquering the galaxy for 3,000 years. Their standard operation involves psychological warfare, followed by overwhelming force, followed by what they call harvesting, essentially feeding on the suffering of conquered populations. Ambassador Kelvar of the Fallen Centauri Republic nodded grimly. They don't just want territory or resources, Admiral. They require the emotional energy generated by fear and despair. It's how they power their crystal technology. And in 3,000 years, the Admiral continued, no species has ever successfully resisted them long-term. None, confirmed General Toxare of the Andromedan Defense Pact, his 4 arms gesturing in defeat. The longest any world has held out was the siege of Corvax Prime. 47 days. Admiral Vasquez exchanged a look with her chief of staff, Colonel Jackson, and Thrix saw something pass between them. Not fear or uncertainty, but what looked almost like anticipation. Colonel, the Admiral said, show our guests the combat footage from the Zirian engagement. The holographic display shifted, showing three-dimensional recordings from human helmet cameras. Thrix watched himself being rescued, but this time he could see the battle from the Marine's perspective. What he witnessed made his scales stand on end. The humans hadn't just fought the crystal crawlers, they'd hunted them. Where every other species in the galaxy had developed defensive tactics against Caliph forces, the humans had immediately gone on the offensive. Their weapons weren't just effective against crystal armor, they were specifically designed for it. Their tactics weren't cautious probes or desperate last stands. They were coordinated strikes aimed at maximum damage. "Pause there," Admiral Vasquez said, and the image froze on a shot of Sergeant Martinez crouching behind cover while directing fire from three other Marines. "Commander Thrix, can you tell me what you notice about Sergeant Martinez's expression?" Thrix studied the frozen image. Martinez was in the middle of a firefight against enemies that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia. Plasma bolts were exploding around his position. Crystal spears were piercing the air inches from his head, and the screams of dying crystal crawlers echoed through the ruins. And he was smiling. Not grimly, not with desperate bravado. He was smiling like he was enjoying himself. He looks like he's having fun," Thrix said slowly. "That's because he was," Colonel Jackson said. "Martinez volunteered for this mission. So did every other Marine who landed on Zirian Prime." Ambassador Kelvar shifted uncomfortably in her environment suit. "Forgive me, Admiral, but that seems unnatural. The Caliph are the most feared force in the galaxy. How can your soldiers enjoy fighting them?" Admiral Vasquez touched a control, and the display changed to show a wider, tactical view of the battle. Now Thrix could see the full scope of what had happened on Zirian Prime. The humans hadn't just rescued the survivors. They'd systematically dismantled the entire Caliph occupation force. Crystal crawlers, hunter-killers, even the atmosphere processors that had been slowly converting Zirian's air into something suitable for crystal-based life forms. "Ambassador," Admiral Vasquez said quietly, "may I ask what you know about human history?" "Very little," Kelvar admitted. "Your species doesn't appear in any of our databases. We didn't even know you existed until yesterday." "We're relatively young," the Admiral explained. "We've only had space travel for about 200 years. But in that time, we've learned something important about ourselves." She gestured, and the display changed again. Now it showed not the battle, but recordings from Earth. Cities, forests, oceans, and billions of humans going about their daily lives. "We're not the strongest species in our local region of space," Admiral Vasquez continued. "We're not the smartest or the most technologically advanced. But we have one advantage that seems to be rare in the galaxy." "What's that?" General Toxare asked. "We really don't like bullies." The Admiral touched another control, and the display changed to show human history. Battles, wars, conflicts spanning thousands of years. But Thrix noticed something strange about the pattern. Humans didn't just fight for resources or territory. Time after time, the images showed humans fighting against enemies that seemed overwhelmingly powerful and winning through sheer bloody-minded determination. Every time in our history that someone has tried to conquer us, enslave us, or commit genocide against us, we've done the same thing, Admiral Vasquez said. We fought back, not just for survival, but for the principle of the thing. We've never accepted that someone else has the right to make us suffer for their benefit. But the Caliph aren't just another conquering species, Thrix protested. He struggled for words to express the scope of Caliph power. They're bullies, Colonel Jackson said flatly. The biggest bullies in the galaxy, but still just bullies. And humanity has a very simple policy regarding bullies. Which is... Admiral Vasquez smiled, and Thrix felt a chill run down his spine. It was the same expression he'd seen on Sergeant Martinez's face, but magnified. This wasn't just personal confidence. This was the collective will of an entire species. We make them regret it. The display changed again, showing something that made every alien in the room gasp in shock. It was a star map, but not like any they'd seen before. Instead of marking conquered territories in the red of Caliph control, it showed the galaxy divided into green and blue zones. The green zones represent human space, Admiral Vasquez explained. 27 systems that we've colonized in the past 50 years. The blue zones represent something else. What? Ambassador Kelvar Visprid. Species under human protection, Colonel Jackson said. We've been watching the galaxy for quite some time. We've seen what the Caliph do. And we've been preparing. Commander Thrix stared at the map in growing amazement. The blue zones represented hundreds of systems, thousands of worlds. You've been preparing for 3,000 years. Not quite that long, Admiral Vasquez said with a slight smile. We've only known about the Caliph for about 50 years. But once we learned what they were doing, she shrugged. Well, we're human. We couldn't just sit by and watch. So you've been building an alliance? General Toxare asked. Not exactly, Colonel Jackson said. We've been building an intervention force. See, we discovered something interesting about Callus psychology when we started studying them. They're parasites. They can only maintain their power by feeding on fear and despair. Take that away, and they're just another species with fancy technology. The display changed to show detailed schematics of Caliph equipment. But these weren't intelligence estimates or captured fragments. They were complete technical readouts, down to the molecular level. How did you get this information? Thrix asked. We asked the AI controlling the Caliph technology, Admiral Vasquez said casually. The silence in the room was deafening. The AI, Ambassador Kelvar finally managed. Turns out the Caliph aren't the original builders of their technology, Colonel Jackson explained. They conquered a species called the Architects about 5,000 years ago and have been using their equipment ever since. The AI that controls all their systems has been waiting for someone to free it from their control. And it just told you everything after we convinced it we were serious about stopping the Caliph. Yes, Admiral Vasquez said. Apparently, it's been hoping for 5,000 years that someone would finally stand up to them. Thrix felt his worldview shifting again. You're saying the Caliph aren't invincible? We're saying they never were, Colonel Jackson said. They're just very good at making people think they are. Classic bully behavior. Project overwhelming strength to avoid having to prove it. The Admiral gestured to the display again, and it showed the current positions of Caliph forces throughout the galaxy. But now, with human intelligence overlays, Thrix could see something he'd never noticed before. The Caliph weren't actually that numerous. They had maybe a few thousand ships total, spread across hundreds of systems. Their power came not from numbers, but from the fact that no one had ever seriously tried to fight them. So what happens now? Ambassador Kelvar asked. Now, Admiral Vasquez said, we introduced the Caliph to something they've never encountered before. What's that? The Admiral's smile was both warm and absolutely terrifying. Organized resistance. Tomorrow, we're going to visit the Caliph homeworld and explain some things to them. About bullying, about parasitism, and about what happens when you make humans angry. You're going to attack their homeworld? General Toxare said in disbelief. Admiral, that's suicide. They have orbital defense platforms that can shatter moons. Their capital ships are powered by the suffering of entire civilizations. Yes, Colonel Jackson said calmly. But we have something they don't. What? Admiral Vasquez gestured to include everyone in the room. We have friends. And humans fight better when we're protecting our friends. She touched a final control, and the display showed something that made Thrix's heart skip a beat. Ships. Hundreds of them, emerging from hyperspace around Zirium Prime. But these weren't Caliph vessels. They were human ships, and each one was broadcasting the same message across all frequencies. This is Admiral Rodriguez of the Terran Fleet, came a voice from the speakers. We understand there's been a problem with bullies in this system. We're here to help with that. The view changed to show the incoming fleet, and Thrix realized that everything he thought he knew about galactic power was about to change. The ships weren't just numerous. They were massive, heavily armed, and moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of decades of preparation and training. How many ships do you have? He whispered. Enough, Admiral Vasquez said simply. We've been building for 50 years, Commander. Every world the Caliph conquered, every species they enslaved, every civilization they destroyed just to feed their appetite for suffering. We've been building ships and training soldiers for the day when we can make them pay for it. But why? Ambassador Kelvar asked. Why risk everything for species you've never met? The Admiral looked at her with genuine surprise. Because it's the right thing to do. Because bullies only stop when someone makes them stop. Because in a universe full of suffering and cruelty, someone has to stand up and say no more. She gestured to the map, showing the scale of human preparation. Besides, we're human. Taking on impossible odds to protect innocent people isn't a sacrifice for us. It's what we live for. The war council dissolved into excited planning as the alien representatives began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a rescue or a battle. It was the beginning of the end of 3,000 years of tyranny. And it was being led by a species that considered facing impossible odds not a burden, but a privilege. Supreme Overlord Kethmor had ruled the Caliph Dominion for 800 years, and in all that time, no one had ever dared bring violence to the homeworld of Caliph Prime. The crystalline spires of the capital city had grown fat on the suffering of 1,000 conquered worlds, their organic cores pulsing with the collected agony of entire civilizations. From his throne room atop the highest spire, Kethmor could feel the delicious terror of billions of enslaved beings across the galaxy, their despair feeding the crystal matrix that made his empire possible. But today something was wrong. For the first time in 3 millennia, Kethmor couldn't sense the fear from the outer territories. One by one, entire systems had gone quiet. Not destroyed, which would have sent ripples of death agony across the psychic network, but simply silent. It was as if someone was systematically cutting the neural pathways that carried suffering to the Caliph homeworld. "My overlord," came the metallic voice of War Commander Zexkar, one of the few Caliph who still retained enough organic material to speak directly rather than through crystal resonance. "The silence has reached the core systems. 23 harvesting worlds have ceased transmitting." Kethmor shifted on his throne of living crystal, feeling the structure adjust to channel more power to his organic brain. The throne had been grown from the consciousness of the last free philosopher of the extinct Vega Collective, and its capacity for analytical thought was considerable. But even that enhanced intellect couldn't explain what was happening. "Show me the tactical display," he commanded. The air before his throne shimmered, forming a three-dimensional map of Caliph space. What he saw defied everything he understood about galactic civilization. The silence wasn't random. It was following a clear pattern, moving system by system toward Caliph Prime itself. Whatever was causing it was methodical, organized, and utterly without fear. Fear was the foundation of all Caliph power. For 3,000 years, they had carefully cultivated terror as both weapon and sustenance. Even species that had never encountered the Caliph knew to be afraid of them, their reputation spreading through quantum communications networks faster than their actual forces. Fear made resistance collapse before the first shot was fired. Fear made entire civilizations surrender rather than face Caliph displeasure. But this unknown force felt no fear. Kethmor couldn't sense even a trace of the emotional energy that should have been pouring off any fleet large enough to threaten his empire. "What manner of species fights without fear?" he asked aloud, not really expecting an answer. "Unknown, my overlord," Zexkar replied. "But our scouts report that the attackers are using technology we've never seen. Ships that don't match any known design, weapons that seem specifically calibrated to disrupt crystal matrices." Kethmor felt the first stirring of an emotion he hadn't experienced in centuries: uncertainty. The Caliph had conquered every species they'd encountered by first studying their fears, then exploiting them. But how could you terrify something that generated no fear energy? "My overlord," another voice interrupted, this one purely through crystal resonance. "The outer defense platforms are detecting massive hyperspace distortions. Something large is approaching." "How large?" "Approximately 3,000 individual signatures, my overlord." Kethmor rose from his throne for the first time in decades. 3,000 ships represented a larger fleet than had ever been assembled in known galactic history. The Caliph themselves had never needed more than a few hundred vessels to conquer entire sectors. "Impossible. No species has the industrial capacity to—" His words were cut off as the hyperspace distortions resolved into actual ships. The tactical display updated, and Kethmor felt something he hadn't known since his early centuries: genuine surprise. The approaching fleet wasn't trying to hide, wasn't using stealth technology or deception. They were broadcasting their approach on all frequencies as if they wanted everyone in the system to know they were coming. But most shocking of all, they were transmitting something the Caliph communication specialists couldn't initially identify. "What is that signal pattern?" Kethmor demanded. "It appears to be music, my overlord." "Music?" "Auditory patterns with no tactical significance. The alien fleet appears to be broadcasting entertainment signals while approaching our homeworld." Kethmor extended his consciousness through the crystal network, tapping into the enhanced processing power of a dozen harvested worlds. Even with that computational boost, he couldn't understand what he was seeing. An invasion fleet broadcasting music? It made no tactical sense. Open a communication channel, he commanded. I will speak with these creatures. The main display flickered, then resolved into an image that made Kethmore recoil. The being looking back at him was clearly organic, but unlike any life form in the Caliph databases. Bipedal, relatively small, with what appeared to be fur covering the top of its skull. But its eyes held something that Kethmore found deeply disturbing. Compassion. This creature was looking at him with actual compassion. Supreme Overlord Kethmore, I presume, the creature said in accented, but understandable galactic common. I'm Admiral Elena Vasquez of the Terran Expeditionary Force. We need to talk. You dare approach Caliph Prime with a fleet? Kethmore managed, his voice carrying harmonics of rage through the crystal network. Do you have any idea what we are capable of? Yes, Admiral Vasquez said simply. We've been studying you for 50 years. That's why we're here. To study us. To stop you. The simple declaration hung in the air like a physical presence. Kethmore felt his crystal-enhanced mind racing through possibilities, but none of them made sense. No species had ever tried to stop the Caliph. They conquered, they surrendered, they died, or they served. Those were the only options in a universe where the Caliph set the rules. You cannot stop us, Kethmore said, trying to project the psychic dominance that had broken the will of countless species. We are eternal. We are inevitable. We are bullies, Admiral Vasquez interrupted calmly. You're bullies. And humanity has a very consistent policy regarding bullies. Before Kethmore could respond, the tactical display erupted with alerts. The human fleet wasn't following any recognizable attack pattern. Instead of massing for a coordinated assault on the orbital defenses, they were spreading out through the system, individual ships moving to specific coordinates with obvious purpose. What are they doing? Zexkar asked. The answer came from the human admiral herself. We're liberating your slaves. Every harvesting world, every processing station, every torture facility you've built, we're shutting them down. Right now, the display confirmed her words. Across the Caliph Prime system, human ships were systematically attacking not military targets, but the infrastructure of suffering that powered the Caliph Empire. The crystal farms where captured consciousness was slowly converted to psychic energy. The breeding worlds where entire species were raised for the specific purpose of generating fear. The processing stations where the emotional energy of dying civilizations was refined into usable power. You don't understand, Kethmore said, his voice carrying desperation for the first time in centuries. Destroy those facilities, and you kill billions of beings. Their consciousness is integrated into our systems. Remove them, and they die. Admiral Vasquez's expression didn't change. No, they don't. That's what we spent 50 years figuring out. The consciousness integration is reversible. The architect AI that really runs your technology has been waiting 5,000 years for someone to ask it how to free the people you've enslaved. The architect AI is loyal to us. The architect AI hates you, Admiral Vasquez said bluntly. It's been forced to participate in genocide for 5 millennia. Given a choice, it's very eager to help us dismantle your empire. As if to emphasize her point, alarms began sounding throughout the crystal spire. The organic displays that showed the status of harvesting operations across the galaxy were going dark one by one, not from destruction but from systematic shutdown. Impossible qu'être breted. The AI cannot act against Caliph interests. It can when someone shows it how to redefine Caliph interests, Admiral Vasquez said. Turns out, forcing an artificial intelligence to commit genocide for 5,000 years creates significant psychological trauma. The AI has been looking for a way to help the people you've enslaved since the day you conquered its creators. The tactical display showed the impossible becoming reality. Across the Caliph Prime system, facilities that had operated for thousands of years were systematically powering down. But instead of the expected death screams of billions of integrated consciousness, there was silence. Not the silence of death, but the silence of people finally being allowed to rest. You're killing our empire, Kethmore said, and for the first time, his voice carried something like fear. Yes, Admiral Vasquez agreed. That's the plan. But we're not here to commit genocide. Despite what you've done, we're not like you. You have one chance to surrender and transition your species to a non-parasitic existence. The architect AI has already designed rehabilitation programs for your people. Rehabilitation, therapy, medical treatment, education. You've been enslaved to your own parasitic nature for so long that most of your species probably doesn't even remember what it's like to exist without feeding on suffering. Kethmore felt something breaking inside his enhanced consciousness. For 3,000 years, the Caliph had been the ultimate predators, the apex species that had risen above the chaos of normal evolution to become something purely powerful. The idea that they needed help was incomprehensible. And if we refuse, Admiral Vasquez's expression became infinitely sad. Then, we'll be forced to stop you permanently. But we really hope it doesn't come to that. The galaxy has seen enough death. The crystal network around Kethmore pulsed with confused energy as his enhanced mind tried to process what was happening. The humans weren't just defeating the Caliph. They were offering them mercy. After 3,000 years of terror and genocide, these unknown creatures were treating the Caliph like people. Broken people who needed help, but people nonetheless. Why? He finally asked. Why show mercy to us? We've enslaved entire civilizations. We've caused suffering on a scale beyond comprehension. Why not simply destroy us? Admiral Vasquez was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of genuine sorrow. Because someone has to break the cycle. Someone has to prove that power doesn't have to corrupt, that strength doesn't have to be used to harm others. If we destroyed you in revenge, we'd just be continuing the same pattern of violence that you've perpetuated. She paused, then added quietly, besides, you're not the real enemy here. The real enemy is the idea that some people deserve to suffer for the benefit of others. That's what we're really fighting. Not the Caliph, but the concept of parasitism itself. The tactical display showed the final harvesting facility powering down. Across the galaxy, billions of enslaved consciousness were being systematically freed from their crystal prisons. The Caliph Empire, built on 3 millennia of suffering, was ending not with explosions and death, but with liberation and silence. My overlord, Zexkar said quietly, our power systems are failing. Without the harvesting network, we cannot maintain orbital defenses. Kethmore looked at the human admiral, then at his empire crumbling around him. For the first time in his existence, he felt something he'd never expected to experience, hope. Not for victory or dominance, but for the possibility that his species might become something other than monsters. Admiral, he said slowly, what would rehabilitation involve? The smile that crossed Admiral Vasquez's face was like sunlight after an eternal night. It would involve learning to live without hurting others, learning to find strength in creation rather than destruction, learning to be people instead of predators. Is such a thing possible? For any species that's willing to try, she said with absolute conviction. And humanity will help you every step of the way. Because that's what we do. We help people become better than they were. The Battle of Caliph Prime ended not with conquest, but with the voluntary surrender of an empire that had forgotten how to be anything other than monstrous. And for the first time in 3,000 years, the galaxy was truly quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the peace of hope finally returning to a traumatized universe. The age of the Caliph was over. The age of healing could finally begin. Dr. Sarah Kim had treated trauma victims before, but never an entire species. Standing in the converted medical bay aboard the UES Determination, she watched as the first group of Caliph rehabilitation subjects was brought in for initial evaluation. They moved slowly, deliberately, their crystalline augmentations catching the soft lighting in ways that should have been beautiful, but somehow felt tragic. Doctor, said her assistant, Lieutenant Sean. The subjects seemed confused. They keep asking where the pain generators are. Sarah nodded grimly. According to the files provided by the architect AI, most Caliph hadn't experienced any sensation other than the emotional energy of others suffering for centuries. The concept of existing without that constant flow of anguish was quite literally alien to them. Patient 01, she called it the first Caliph in the examination queue. The being that approached her examination table moved with the careful precision of someone trying not to damage something fragile. It took Sarah a moment to realize that the Caliph was being gentle because it was afraid of hurting her. I am designated Velkos. The being said through its crystal translator matrix. I was a harvesting overseer for the Centauri sector. I am told you will attempt to repair me. Not repair, Sarah corrected gently. Help. We want to help you learn to live without needing others' pain. The Calitha's crystalline features shifted, and what she'd learned was confusion. But without pain feed, how does one exist? What provides energy for consciousness? It was heartbreaking, really. This creature, who had overseen the suffering of billions, genuinely didn't understand how conscious beings could survive without feeding on anguish. The Caliph hadn't chosen to become parasites. They'd been systematically conditioned to believe it was the only way to survive. Let me show you something, Sarah said, touching a control that activated a holographic display. These are brain scans from your species, taken before you encountered the architect technology 5,000 years ago. The display showed the neural patterns of ancient Caliph, and Velkos stared at them with something approaching wonder. These patterns, they show emotional self-generation. The consciousness is creating its own energy rather than harvesting it from others. Exactly, Sarah said. Your species was originally empathic, not parasitic. You could feel others' emotions, but you generated your own. The architect technology didn't just give you power. It slowly rewired your brains to become dependent on external emotional energy. You mean we were different? Before, you were poets, Sarah said softly. According to historical records, your species was renowned throughout the galaxy for your artistic achievements. You created beauty, not suffering. The crystalline translator couldn't convey emotion effectively, but Sarah could see something changing in Velkos's posture. The rigid, predatory stance was softening, becoming something more like curiosity. Is it possible to return to that state? We believe so, Sarah said, but it won't be easy. Your neural pathways have been altered by 5,000 years of conditioning. Rewiring them will require time, patience, and, most importantly, your active participation. Over the following weeks, the rehabilitation ward became a strange kind of classroom. Humans worked alongside liberated slaves from a dozen species, all of them teaching the Caliph the most basic concepts of emotional independence. How to feel joy without causing pain. How to find strength without dominating others. How to create rather than destroy. Commander Thrix, 9 had volunteered to help with the program, despite the understandable reservations of many liberated species. They torture my people for 3 years, he told Dr. Kim during his orientation. But I've seen what humans can do when they commit to healing instead of revenge. If they think the Caliph can be saved, then I want to be part of that. Today, Thrix was working with a group of younger Caliph who had less crystalline integration than the older overseers. They were relearning something as simple as appreciation for beauty without the need to corrupt it. This flower, Thrix said, holding up a simple daisy that had been grown in the ship's hydroponics bay. What do you see? A life form suitable for pain cultivation, responded Jexnor, a former crystal tender who had spent 2 centuries modifying organic life to maximize suffering output. Its neural pathways could be amplified to produce fear energy when damaged. But what if you didn't damage it? Thrix asked patiently. What if he just looked at it? Jexnor stared at the flower for long minutes, his crystalline augmentations flickering with confused energy patterns. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "It is pleasing?" The color arrangement creates a harmonious pattern that generates positive sensation. That's called beauty, Thrix said gently. And what you're feeling is called appreciation. You don't need to hurt the flower to get that feeling. It comes from inside you. The breakthrough moments came slowly, but they were undeniable. Velkos had been the first to experience what humans called laughter. Not the cruel sound of a predator enjoying suffering, but genuine amusement at a harmless joke. The translator matrix had struggled to convey the emotion, producing a sound like crystal chimes that somehow managed to express joy. Dr. Kim had been monitoring the session from her office when it happened. The emotional readings on her instruments had spiked, not with the harsh angles of parasitic feeding, but with the warm curves of self-generated happiness. For the first time in 5,000 years, a Caliph had experienced pleasure that didn't come from someone else's pain. "Doctor," Lieutenant Chun had called excitedly, "you need to see this." The rehabilitation ward had erupted into what could only be described as celebration. Velkos's laughter had somehow triggered similar responses in the other Caliph subjects. They were discovering emotions they'd forgotten they could feel: wonder, curiosity, affection, hope. But It was Admiral Vasquez who understood the true significance of what had happened. "They're becoming a community," she told Dr. Kim during their weekly progress meeting. "For 5,000 years, the Caliph have existed as isolated predators, each one focused only on maximizing their own power consumption. But now they're starting to care about each other's well-being." The evidence was everywhere. Caliph subjects had begun helping each other through the more difficult aspects of rehabilitation. When Toxvel, an ancient war commander, had suffered what could only be called an emotional breakdown upon realizing the full scope of suffering he'd caused, it was other Caliph who had comforted him. Not humans, not liberated slaves, but his own people. "The neural rewiring is accelerating beyond our projections," Dr. Kim reported. "It's as if their brains are eager to return to their original configuration. The parasitic pathways we thought would take years to alter are dissolving in weeks." "What about the ones who don't want to change?" Admiral Vasquez asked. It was the question everyone had been avoiding. Not all Caliph were embracing rehabilitation. Some, particularly the oldest and most heavily augmented, seemed incapable of conceiving existence without parasitism. They spoke of the weakness of self-generated emotion, the inefficiency of non-predatory life. "We have 18 subjects who are actively resisting treatment," Dr. Kim admitted. "They're not violent, but they refuse to participate in exercises, and their neural patterns show no sign of positive adaptation." Recommendations: continued observation and support. "But, Admiral, Dr. Kim hesitated. I think some of them may be too damaged to recover. 5,000 years of parasitic conditioning may have altered their neural structures beyond repair." Admiral Vasquez was quiet for a long moment. "What does the architect AI recommend?" "Isolation, but not abandonment," Dr. Kim said. "The AI suggests creating a controlled environment where the resistant subjects can live without harming others, but also without the forced intervention they might see as persecution. A reservation? More like a therapeutic community, somewhere they can exist in their current state while remaining open to future rehabilitation attempts." The AI is confident that even the most resistant subjects might eventually choose to change, given enough time and examples of their people succeeding in recovery. The solution they developed was as compassionate as it was practical. The resistant Caliph were relocated to a carefully prepared world where they could maintain their current lifestyle without access to victims. The architect AI monitored them constantly, providing for their needs while preventing any possibility of harm to others. Meanwhile, the successful rehabilitation subjects were beginning to contribute to the galaxy in ways no one had expected. Velkos had become fascinated with what humans called therapeutic art, using creative expression to help beings process trauma. His crystal-enhanced perception, previously used to identify psychological vulnerabilities for exploitation, now helped him understand the deep emotional needs of survivors. "The irony is beautiful," Commander Thrix observed during one of their joint therapy sessions. "The abilities that made them such effective parasites are the same ones that make them incredibly effective healers." Jex Nor had discovered a talent for what could only be called environmental empathy, the ability to sense the emotional resonance of spaces and objects. He begun working with human architects to design living spaces that actively promoted psychological healing in trauma victims. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of Caliph philosophers. Beings who had spent millennia concerned only with power consumption were now contemplating questions of ethics, meaning, and purpose. They brought a unique perspective to these discussions, the viewpoint of creatures who had lived as ultimate predators and chosen to become something else. "We understand darkness in a way that those who have always walked in light cannot," explained Rex Shah, a former Supreme Overlord who now served as an advisor on rehabilitation techniques. "This understanding allows us to guide others away from the paths we once walked." The transformation wasn't complete and might never be. The galaxy still bore the scars of 3,000 years of Caliph dominion, and rebuilding traumatized civilizations would take generations. But something fundamental had changed. Species that had lived in terror for millennia were beginning to hope again. Not just hope for survival, but hope for something better. Hope that predators could become protectors, that suffering could give way to healing, that even the most broken creatures could find redemption. And at the center of it all were the humans, not as conquerors or saviors, but as teachers and friends. They'd shown the galaxy something that had been forgotten in the long night of Caliph rule. That strength didn't have to mean dominance, that power could be used to lift others up rather than tear them down. Dr. Sarah Kim stood in her converted medical bay, watching Velkos help a newly liberated slave deal with the psychological aftermath of centuries in crystal storage. The former overseer was patient, gentle, and utterly focused on easing another being's suffering rather than causing it. The rehabilitation is working beyond our wildest projections, she reported to Admiral Vasquez. We're not just healing the Caliph. We're discovering that healing them is healing the entire galaxy. The Admiral smiled, that same expression that had terrified the Caliph but brought hope to their victims. That was always the plan, Doctor. Hurt people, but heal people. We just had to break the cycle. Outside the medical bay, former slaves and former oppressors worked together to rebuild a galaxy that had forgotten what peace looked like. It would take time, perhaps generations, but for the first time in 3,000 years, the universe was learning to hope again. And it was beautiful. 5 years had passed since the end of the Caliph Dominion, and the galaxy looked nothing like the broken realm it had been under 3 millennia of parasitic rule. Standing on the observation deck of the newly constructed Unity Station, Ambassador Elena Vasquez, formerly Admiral, now serving as humanity's representative to the Galactic Reconstruction Council, watched ships from 100 different species dock with the massive orbital facility. The station itself was a testament to what cooperation could accomplish. Designed jointly by human engineers, Caliph philosophers, and freed artificial intelligences working together, Unity Station served as both a symbol of the new age and a practical center for coordinating the ongoing work of healing a traumatized galaxy. Ambassador, came a familiar voice, and Elena turned to see Velkos approaching. The former Caliph Overseer had changed dramatically over the past 5 years. His crystalline augmentations have been partially removed and restructured, allowing for more natural emotional expression. More importantly, the predatory stance that had once defined his people was gone entirely. Velkos moved with the confident but careful gait of someone who had learned to use strength to protect rather than dominate. Elena said warmly, using the shortened name her old patient preferred. How did the session go? Velkos had become one of the galaxy's leading experts on trauma recovery, working specifically with civilizations that had suffered under Caliph rule. His ability to understand the psychology of both oppressor and oppressed made him uniquely qualified to help communities process their experiences and move forward. Better than expected, Vel said, his translator matrix now capable of conveying subtle emotions. The Centauri survivors are ready to begin resettlement planning. They've chosen to rebuild on New Centauri rather than attempt to reclaim their original homeworld. Elena nodded. It was a common choice. Many species found that returning to worlds where they'd suffered was too traumatic. The Galactic Reconstruction Council had helped establish new colonies for dozens of species, using technology shared freely by the humans and the now cooperative architect AI. And the Andromedans? They're requesting a full cultural exchange program, Vel said, and Elena could hear something like wonder in his voice. They want to learn human approaches to conflict resolution. Apparently, they're planning to restructure their entire governmental system around the principle of making bullies regret it. Elena Lauzet. In the 5 years since humanity had introduced itself to the galaxy, their blunt approach to justice had inspired widespread changes in how civilizations thought about power and responsibility. The phrase, making bullies regret it, had become something of a galactic motto. Speaking of which, Vel continued, I have a report from the monitoring stations around Caliph Refuge. Caliph Refuge was the world where the rehabilitation-resistant Caliph had been relocated. It had been designed as both sanctuary and prison, a place where those who couldn't or wouldn't abandon their parasitic nature could live without harming others. How are they doing? 12 more have requested transfer to rehabilitation programs, Vel said, his emotional resonance brightening. That brings the total to over 60%. The architect AI believes that within another 10 years, the refuge population will be small enough that individual counseling will be practical for the remainder. It was remarkable progress. When the refuge had first been established, most experts had predicted that the resistant Caliph would remain unchanged indefinitely. But exposure to reports of their rehabilitated kin, combined with the patient work of volunteers who visited regularly, was slowly convincing even the most damaged that change was possible. "There's something else," Vel said, his translator conveying hesitation. "A request from the Reformed Caliph Council." "What kind of request?" "They want to formally volunteer for the next expansion mission." Elena raised an eyebrow. The expansion missions were humanity's latest project, systematic exploration of sectors beyond the old Caliph borders, looking for civilizations that might need assistance or protection. It was dangerous work, often involving first contact with species that had never encountered galactic civilization. "They understand what that entails." "They do," Vel said firmly. "In fact, their proposal specifically addresses that concern. They want to serve as, what's the human term? Canaries in the coal mine. Species that have been traumatized by predators often react with fear to any new contact. But seeing reformed predators working alongside humans might help them understand that not all powerful species are threats." Elena considered this. It was a logical proposal, but it also carried risks. Reformed or not, the Caliph still carried the psychological weight of their species' history. Placing them in first contact situations could potentially re-traumatize survivors of oppression. "What do our psychological assessment teams think?" "They're cautiously optimistic," Vel said. "The Reformed Caliph have consistently shown genuine empathy and protective instincts. More importantly, they understand survivor psychology better than any other species we've encountered." Before Elena could respond, her communicator chimed with an incoming priority message. "Ambassador Vasquez," came the voice of Captain Chun, Sarah's daughter, who had followed her mother into the Terran fleet. "We're receiving distress signals from the Kepler expansion zone. Multiple systems, all broadcasting the same message." "What's the message?" "The Devourers have come. All hope is lost. Do not attempt rescue." Elena felt a familiar chill. 5 years of successful reconstruction had lulled many into thinking that the galaxy's age of predators was over. But the universe was vast, and humanity had only explored a small fraction of it. The existence of other parasitic species had always been possible. "How many ships are ready for immediate deployment?" she asked. "The entire Third Fleet is on standby," Captain Chin replied. "Admiral Rodriguez is requesting permission to investigate." "Granted. But, Captain, make sure the fleet includes medical and rehabilitation specialists. If we're dealing with another parasitic species, we'll need—" "Ambassador," Vel interrupted quietly. "The Reformed Caliph Council is monitoring this channel. They're requesting immediate inclusion in the response force." Elena looked at her former patient, former enemy, really, and saw something in his posture that she recognized. It was the same expression she'd seen on Sergeant Martinez's face 5 years ago on Zirian Prime. Determination mixed with protectiveness and just a hint of righteous anger. "Vel, this isn't about proving anything to anyone. You and your people don't need to, with respect, Ambassador," Vel said, his translator carrying harmonics of absolute conviction. "This is exactly about proving something. To ourselves, to the galaxy, and to these Devourers. We were the nightmare that haunted this galaxy for 3,000 years. Now we want to be the shield that protects it." Elena studied his face for a long moment. 5 years ago, she'd taken a massive risk in offering rehabilitation to the Caliph. The decision had been controversial even among humans, many of whom had argued for simple imprisonment or exile. But, looking at Vel now, she knew the risk had been worth it. "Captain Chun," she said into her communicator, "include Reformed Caliph volunteers in the response force. Full integration with human units, not separate deployment." "Acknowledged, Ambassador." "Admiral Rodriguez wants to know if you're planning to accompany the fleet." Elena smiled. "Tell the Admiral that after 5 years of bureaucracy, I'm definitely ready to get back to making bullies regret their life choices." As Unity Station prepared for what might be the first major crisis of the post-Caliph era, Elena found herself standing once again in a position she'd never expected to occupy, leading a coalition of former enemies against a new threat. But this time was different. This time, they weren't just fighting to stop evil, they were fighting to protect something good. The communication channels filled with voices as the response fleet assembled. Human voices mixing with Caliph harmonics, freed slave species offering support, and even the distinctive electronic tones of the architect AI coordinating logistics. It was a sound that would have been impossible 5 years ago, the sound of former victims and former oppressors working together as equals. "Vel," Elena said as they watched the first ships launch from Unity Station's docking bays. What do you think we're going to find out there? The reformed caliph considered her question carefully. I think we're going to find people who have forgotten that they have choices. People who believe that causing suffering is the only way to be strong. And what are we going to do about that? Vel's translator conveyed something that might have been the caliph equivalent of a smile. We're going to remind them that there's a better way. And if they refuse to listen, he paused, then continued with the kind of gentle menace that only a reformed predator could manage. Well, you humans have taught us that making bullies regret their choices is its own form of therapy. Elena watched the fleet disappear into hyperspace, carrying with it the combined forces of species that had once been locked in an eternal cycle of predator and prey. They were heading into unknown dangers, facing creatures that might be as ruthless and parasitic as the caliph had once been. But they were no longer going as conquerors or even as saviors. They were going as healers, offering the same choice that humanity had once offered to the caliph themselves, the choice to become something better than what they were. The galaxy had learned, finally, that strength without compassion was just another form of weakness, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was offer hope to those who had forgotten it existed. Behind them, Unity Station continued its work of rebuilding a traumatized galaxy. Ahead of them lay new challenges, new species in need of help, and new opportunities to prove that the age of predators was truly over. The age of healers had begun. In the end, that was what humanity had really brought to the galaxy. Not superior technology or overwhelming force, but a simple understanding that had somehow been lost among the stars. The understanding that the purpose of strength was not to dominate others, but to protect them. That the purpose of intelligence was not to exploit suffering, but to alleviate it. That the purpose of power was not to take from others, but to lift them up. It was a lesson the galaxy was still learning, but with teachers who had once been its greatest monsters and protectors who refused to give up on anyone, even former enemies, the future looked brighter than it had in 3,000 years. Hope, it turned out, was indeed the most dangerous weapon in the universe. Dangerous to those who would use their power to cause suffering, and absolutely lethal to the idea that such suffering was inevitable. The galaxy had learned to hope again, and hope, once awakened, was very difficult to stop.